ask you about the 5-point recommendation that you have presented. You've come out for cryptocurrency. Tell us about that, please.
So if you look at the whole premise of it, India Tech, as you know, is working in areas where the startups are either struggling with regard to regulation, because most of the space is a disruptive space. And we were working, if you look at it, largely around the startup space, where there are a lot of challenges and issues which we are working with the government on. But we realized that there is another emerging area, which is in the crypto space, where the narrative has been largely around the fact that India needs crypto and the fact that why India should dabble in crypto. There have been plenty of white papers and documents which have been brought by different people, contributing to the healthy kind of narrative in the space, which actually was tending towards saying that crypto is good, why it needs to be there, it is safe, and all that stuff. But if you look at the concerns that existed in the government mindset, and here by government, I mean I'm splitting it into two. One is the regulator, and other is the government. Uh, I mean, before getting into this journey, I was having a chat with most of the stakeholders in the ecosystem, whether it was the exchanges, whether the cryptocurrency holders, the startups, and of course the government, and government across different streams. Interestingly, I got 15 questions, which turned out to be areas of concern. So, what we did was we started filtering these 15 concerns. And we said, okay, each of these fall under certain buckets. And that's how those 5-point recommendations came in. So, if you look at it, the 5-point recommendations are actually the broader ones, which encompass further into 15 minor points, which have been addressed fairly as part of an attempt to see if this can answer the concern. So the first point that we said was, and this comes out after looking at all the regulations, is that the fundamental understanding or the kind of concern that existed both in terms of regulator and governments and stakeholders was crypto is like a currency and it will replace maybe tomorrow our currency. So the fundamental aspect that existed was that how do we go about addressing that concern? Because are we ready to have another currency where we don't know who is backing it? At least I know for sure that a dollar is backed by X government, a pound is backed by Y government. So the question was that this doesn't happen in this space. So how do we go about addressing this concern? So our recommendation to that was, let's start with defining crypto. And we do not, as a country, look currently for the timing. I mean, future, we don't know. We may mature to call it a currency someday. But let's look at it that it's a finite asset. And let's look at it as a digital asset. And therefore, we do two things. One is we don't call it a currency. I mean, it may have terms like cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and so on, which are synonymous with some real world currencies, but we call it as a crypto asset. And therefore, also from a concern standpoint of who is holding it, where is it getting traded, we also said let's introduce a system of registering local homegrown crypto exchange startups in this space and say, okay, we are defining it as a crypto asset. We will now allow probably to start with trading only on local homegrown crypto exchanges, which are Indian founded startups, which are in this space, and figure out a mechanism to regulate and have the checks and balances which address the concerns we have. So the moment you've called it a crypto asset, automatically rest of the things fall in place, for the simple reason that we already have mechanisms on how to tax assets. We already have mechanisms on how to kind of deal with trading of such assets. And by assets, I don't mean long-term fixed assets. I'm meaning current assets, and these are the ones which will start largely sit in your balance sheet under the head current assets. So we started unraveling this, and what we found out was the moment you call it a digital asset, it's much easier. But although it does require a lot of other departments to get in, we automatically start building in checks and balances. There are already checks and balances which are notified under various laws, including anti-money laundering law, the combating financing of terrorism regulations, and so on. Apart from that, the FATF also has come up with guidances. So all of that fall in place automatically. The third aspect is therefore, so the first aspect is define crypto, introduce a system of registering local homegrown crypto exchanges. The second part is checks and balances. The third part is taxation. How do you treat it in direct and indirect taxation? So therefore the concern comes in to say, okay, if I treat it as a current asset and I enable traceability and I combat any anti-money laundering, plus of course the CFT, which is around terrorism, how do I go about taxing it? Because I need to define what it is. And the moment I define it as a digital asset, depending on the nature of your business, we said that you could be a trader in it, or you could be an individual like you and me who are just dabbling in crypto. And therefore, it could be treated based on people like us and the timeline of holding. We could call it as a short term or a long term capital asset. And therefore, the capital gains tax appropriately will fit in depending on the gain or loss we make on it. Apart from that, we also encourage self regulation, because we realize that there is a large set of regulations plus housekeeping that has to be put in place, and therefore one way to address that easily would be self regulation, because the government is now dabbling with self regulations in other areas like they did for OTT and so on. So we then therefore defined under these broad things. For example, in definition we said, okay, I mean, if you look at Australia, US, they have called it as a property, and therefore they are looking at it as an asset. Indian ownership requirements for the startups, we did recommend something. For example, we said that in the banking sector, if you are willing to allow your cash to be held with a 74% FDI cap, then you're saying that 26% is what the Indian founder should hold. We said apply the same logic here, because if you have entrusted the cash of your country with banks which have 74% FDI, the same thing can apply here in terms of trust factor. We also have actually recommended that every customer who trades in crypto in India should have a KYC process in place, and it should be compliant with the laws of the land. We also realize there are no accounting standards which specify on this, so we have actually requested the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. We have written to different ministries because we realize that there are different stakeholders who would actually require to kind of come into play. So, for example, the accounting standards have to be brought out, which could be a clarification from the Chartered Accountants Institute and the Cost Accountants Institute to say, how would you value it at the end of the year when you disclose your holding? What are the valuation mechanisms to be put in place? Same things would apply in the case of marketable securities. So the same thing could be applied here. And therefore, where would you disclose? Whether you would disclose it in your, whether the auditors have to disclose about, mention about it, whether the notes on accounts in the balance sheet have to mention it, whether it has to be brought appropriately under a head under the current assets, and therefore the further notes and schedules should also elaborate on the classification and type of holdings and so on. Apart from that, we also have recommended that suspicious transaction reporting mechanism should be put in place, because currently you do report on suspicious transactions in other things. For example, in the cyber event, you do report to a certain, in this case, you may report to an FIU or an equivalent which the government may notify. And of course, we have also said in terms of direct taxation, you could decide on whether it should be profits and gains from business or profession, or income from capital gains and so on. GST ideally should be applicable only on the platform and the convenience fee, and not on the whole trade. This is a problem which existed even in the gaming sector. And of course, in terms of disclosure, we have said, so that the government doesn't get terrified that there are so much of people holding crypto, but I don't know who they are. We also said that you could also add a clause like the Schedule AL in the income tax return, where you say, okay, this is the amount of crypto I hold. In fact, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has already come out with a disclosure norm for corporates. And the most important thing that we have also recommended, which is critical from an RBI standpoint, is that RBI is concerned that, okay, everybody is KYCs, all of us are doing our business, all of us are trading, everything is fine. But what if I get in more inventory from abroad? It's like getting gold into the country. It's like getting stuff into the country. So do we put FEMA regulations, and do we assign how much of holding, how much of each person is permitted to bring what amount of value of cryptos? If import has to be happened, is it through a notified operator like an authorized dealer or somebody equivalent who is allowed to import crypto? And therefore there are disclosure norms, because you can't be playing around with, you have 50 today, I have 50 today, tomorrow you have 25, I have 75. I mean, we can't be playing around. There would be a need for infusing more inventory into the system. So what we have said is, these are the ways in which you can look at it. And of course, there are issues in the crypto world where you also issue this concept of tokens and all. So we have said that possibly you could figure out a way. We have suggested 3 or 4 methods. And we have also said, like, for example, US has the Howey test to determine if tokens are securities and so on. and so therefore things like those could be looked at. So that broadly in a nutshell what we have tried to recommend. We've got into the nuts and bolts to say this is the way you have concerns on all of this, these are the ways you can address it, but provided you start defining them as not a currency, because that's, I mean, frankly, if you ask me, if you call it a currency you can't tax it, but if you call it as a digital asset you can, and therefore it gives much more legitimacy to the whole thing.
When it comes to crypto, blockchain, Bitcoin, this world, it is known for its decentralized behavior, right? Because it empowers the end user, which was never there, so to say, before. Now, I want to ask you your recommendation. Does it, curtail that power? And you would have studied the behavior globally. What are some of the things that you saw the other countries are doing?
Yeah, so if I mean we did look at other countries, and the fact that the fundamental fact is that the way they looked at it. For example, if you look at FATF guidances that came in a month ago, Japan said we are looking at it and we want to implement it. So people are evolving, people are looking at it. They are not going the banning route, but I mean to your point, we did dabble on that to say okay, I mean it's decentralized, it's out of control. We may not know who holds what, whether the trail exists or not, and I mean pretty sure that the government will come back and say okay, look, you're not able to establish a trail, all this is fine, but what about that?
Yeah.
And therefore what we said was okay, look at blockchain, I mean Bitcoin for example. I mean Bitcoin does open an audit trail, and it's an open ledger kind of concept where you can look certain bits of it. So therefore initial way India could look at is to say okay, we will allow only that class of cryptocurrencies which are open in nature and which do offer this audit trail to the extent that is required, and we are looking at, and we could say that this family of people who behave this way will be allowed to trade, and which means that that's one way of addressing it. But yes, to your point, this the need for which I had to go so intricate and detailed into digging up nuts and bolts of it was that it's purely this nature, the decentralized nature of it. And I'm sure that if I'm fighting a battle to say ban versus allow, this is a foot, this is a foot in the door where we are saying okay, you have all these concerns, let's fix all of this, but don't shut the door,
Yeah.
because this is not something India should be missing out on.
There are two sides, and the world is also, it's not just India, the world is divided, and some of the big guys in the world are saying no, and some are saying yes. What is your view? Because it is here to stay, right? Crypto will define our future.
Yeah, so I mean, we have as a country had a lot of regrets in the past, saying, "Oh, we missed that bus, we missed this bus, we missed the semiconductor chip manufacturing bus, we missed the hardware bus, we got into services, and we caught on to that bus." So I mean, there are plenty of regrets that as a country we have had in the past when we looked at technologies which were within grasp and reach, but maybe because of certain thought process and policies we missed out. Now this is something where it is fast growing. As I said, I'm not someone who is saying let's all out go and embrace. We should embrace it with checks and balances, which is why we have recommended. I mean, it doesn't usually come that an industry body says regulate it, go the full mile, and then try to tighten all these nuts and bolts. But it is a question of will we miss out on these opportunities, and 5 years later we shouldn't regret and to say that okay, 5 years later we matured as a country to look at this, but by which time the world has gone way ahead and we are going to catch up. And
Yeah.
that shouldn't be the case. So it's always good to dabble. I mean, the statements given by the FM and others were encouraging in that nature to say, okay, we are not shutting the door, but we also realize that the government needs to be armed with this kind of a logic to say, hey, there is another way to look at it. Let's try to kind of regulate it, because these mechanisms exist, and this assures those suspicions that we have in our head. And I'm not saying that what I've suggested is a foolproof, but at least it has plugged 15 holes with 5 broad classifications. If you find a 16th hole, we'll figure it out rather than figuring out. I mean, getting terrified that there are 15 holes today.
You would be engaging with some very interesting people, and I heard someone, Puneet, has also been engaged with you in some way or the other. So I want to ask you, who are some of the, which are some of the interesting startups that you are seeing in this space and you think are going to be very, some, not I would say big, but companies to look out for?
Well, if you look at, I mean, we were looking at a global space and we were surprised to see there are 300 startups which have emerged in this space globally.
Wow.
And the amount of investments that has gone is billions of dollars. If you look at Singapore alone in the last 6 to 9 months, they have pulled in $750 million just on this particular aspect. The
Wow.
startups which have emerged in Singapore, and we are something like 0.2% of the global pie that is there. There are already three or four large exchanges. You must be seeing that day in and day out. Those are Indian ones which have emerged. Now, the point is that these are the ones we should handhold and help them grow, because one, they have figured it out how to crack this, and it's a great thing. I mean, by having an Indian exchange, having players in the Indian ecosystem, one, fundamentally you are not losing those billions of dollars which go as commissions to global marketplaces,
Yeah.
which will continue to happen. I mean, Indians are smart people from that regard. They'll figure out a way to hold or trade or whatever. But the point is
Yeah.
that why should we lose out that kind of money going as an outflow? The second part is, of course, that why should we kind of not nurture and grow these things out of India? I mean, this is a wonderful opportunity for the startup ecosystem to grow and nurture. And plus, if you look at the next generation, I mean, like, maybe probably what was gold for the earlier generation, this might be the next gold. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, a gold is a metal. It's the value, intrinsic value is dependent on how you value it, right? I mean, a diamond is a piece of carbon, but people do give value to it, right? That
Yeah, as you said, these are assets.
Yeah, these are assets. And the next gen is looking at these as assets. I'm not sure how many of the next gen, if I ask saying, oh, do you need a diamond or gold? I mean, anybody would be interested. I've not seen that kind of a craze. But if I
Yeah.
say a Bitcoin, probably they might jump. So there is the next generation of consumers is evolving. The next generation of craze is going to a different direction. And
Yeah.
we shouldn't be missing out on some of these.
Ramesh, I want to ask you, of course, you've come up with this recommendation and such an exhaustive and detailed recommendation. What excites you about, because I know you work across spectrum, what excites you about this space and the potential it has for India?
Well, if you look at the startup space as such, anything that comes in this space and technology, of course, it is all disruption. And disruption, any disruption, if you look at it, is driven by innovation. So, therefore, and it will always have regulators gasping to catch up on this front, because I mean, the moment you innovate and you disrupt, you're actually blowing certain borders away, certain limitations away, and you've evolved a new business model, which means that the regulators have to catch up. Regulations wouldn't have arrived in that space, but at the same time, regulation should not be retrofitted to stifle innovation. So, I mean, for us at India Tech, I think one of the things that drives us, if you look at, we even got onto the gaming space pretty early and we came out with recommendations. I think one of the things that drives us is any area that has a huge potential for innovation and growth for Indian entrepreneurs and Indian startups, but has a regulatory red flag. We try to get into that to see how we can bring both sides together on the same plane. Of course, this is not a one-sided approach we take. We also expect the industry to walk a couple of steps forward and the government 4 or 5 steps forward, because that's the kind of change in thinking that needs to be brought about. But I guess that is the most exciting part of bridging the gap and seeing it happen in front of your eyes. If there is a potential situation where you say, okay, either you shut the door or get your foot in the door or walk inside the door, and harmoniously both sides live, thrive. Our job is to say that, I mean, if an industry is struggling, how can I make it survive and also thrive, and then grow out of it? So, I mean, if you look at this particular space, we were looking at data, and that's the most exciting part. I mean, the global user base has increased something like 190% between just 2 years. I'm talking about
How
data
many
from,
users would be there approximately in the world?
well, it's more than 200 million. That's what I was
Wow.
told, and that's a phenomenal growth in 2 years' time. Uh, I'm not saying that lockdown is making people dabble in this. This is not that. This is bet the pandemic lockdown expectations. It has grown. It's a all time. The valuation market caps today stands at $2 trillion. as of this month. And if you look at, I mean, the global thing, I mean, like we are looking at a market where how much of that can come to India. I mean, as I said, in the last 1 year, around $5.5 billion were brought into the blockchain startups around, but we have received something like 0.2% of this capital. And as I mentioned, Singapore, I mean, $750 million is amazing in a span of 1 year. We are
Yeah.
missing out as such a close entity, being a tech entity, and we call ourselves a tech kind of in the forefront of tech in the country. So basically, one is this. The second part is that if 300 startups have emerged, that's something which is the next area to look at. And more importantly, it has given thousands of jobs. There are multiple levels of job creation that are happening in this space, both in terms of crypto, the kind of models of businesses that are emerging out of it, and more importantly, exchanges and so on. All of that
Yeah.
are actually triggering mass employment. So obviously, I mean, there is something to look at.
Out of everything that you would have done, this would be the most, if I may say so, from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, yeah,
Because India stands globally, people say that, okay, India is not, proactive, or India is not for crypto, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
our take is that, look, we have put this across. We have given a solution which is more. I mean, what we have suggested is not rocket science. You must be.
yeah,
What we have suggested is a very practical approach, saying this is doable. Let's fix it this way. Uh, it may appeal to the government. It may appeal to the regulators. Maybe they will take it up, but you can't ignore the fact that this is such a simple solution, which is doable for everyone. It is also a fact that the Indian startups which are working in the space, including the exchanges, are game for being regulated. But I mean, our kind of request to the government is that there are people who are willing to put their neck in. There are people willing to be regulated. There are mechanisms which are so simple, available to track it and implement it. So let's not look the other way, uh,
yeah.
by being concerned about what's happening globally. In fact, frankly, if we don't take this route, we will end up. I mean, I'm not a protectionist guy, but I'm making the statement that people will still dabble in it. People will figure out ways and means to do it. So what we are actually creating is a thriving system which is outside the legitimate system, and plus huge amount of money sitting abroad in places where they shouldn't be sitting. I mean, the ultimate beneficiary would be the outside ecosystem, when you have got a wonderful chance to nurture the local system and still address your concerns.
Now, thank you, Ramesh. Thank you, because this is a very important conversation. Since last 2 years in India, the conversation has mostly been negative, right? And I'm sure the government is open to listen to this, and then with your detailed recommendation, you will find the right ears. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.